The store's lights flickered in sync with footsteps I couldn't hear. I didn't notice it at first. At 2 in the morning, the convenience store always felt like it was half asleep, and the lights had their own habits. They buzzed softly above the aisles, sometimes dimming for a breath before brightening again. The refrigerators along the back wall hummed in a steady mechanical drone, like distant traffic that never quite reached the building. I was leaning against the counter scrolling through my phone when the first flicker happened. Just a blink. The overhead lights dimmed for a fraction of a second and came back. I looked up automatically, the way you do when something changes in a quiet room. The aisles stretched away in pale fluorescent rows. Candy, chips, dusty plastic toys no one had bought in months. Everything exactly where it had been a moment ago. The automatic doors were closed. The parking lot outside was empty. I went back to my phone. A few seconds later, the lights flickered again. This time twice. Blink, blink. I frowned and looked up again. Old wiring, probably. The place had been built in the early 90s and nothing inside it had been replaced unless it absolutely had to be. Still, something about the timing made me listen. When you work the night shift long enough, silence becomes a language. You start recognizing patterns in it. The rhythm of refrigerators cycling on and off. The soft rattle of the ice machine behind the counter. Even the faint hiss of air slipping under the door when a car passes outside. So when the lights flickered again, once, then a pause, then once more, I noticed the spacing. Blink, pause, blink. I waited. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then the lights flickered again. Blink, blink. A strange thought crossed my mind. It sounded like footsteps. Not the sound itself, there wasn't any sound, but the timing of it. The spacing between the flickers felt like someone walking slowly across a hard floor. Step, step. I laughed quietly under my breath. Working alone too long will make you invent patterns in anything. Still, I looked down the nearest aisle just in case someone had come in without me noticing. The shelves stood motionless. A tower of soda bottles reflected the fluorescent light in dull stripes. A cardboard display of beef jerky leaned slightly to one side like it always had. No one there. Behind me, the refrigerators hummed louder for a moment before settling back into their steady vibration. I told myself it was nothing. The lights flickered again. Blink. Pause. Blink. I straightened slowly. That pause was longer. Long enough to feel like distance. Like someone taking another step. My eyes moved down the aisles again. Slower this time. Shadows shifted faintly along the floor as the buzzing bulbs overhead trembled. The store felt larger than usual. Too much empty space between the shelves. "Hello," I called. My voice sounded strange in the quiet. Then, the word slipped down the aisles and faded against the refrigerators. No answer. The lights flickered again. Blink. Closer. That was the thought that came to me immediately, though I couldn't explain why. There was still no sound of shoes on tile. No creak of the door. No rustle of a jacket brushing a shelf. Just the flicker. And the pause between them. I pushed myself away from the counter and stepped out into the aisle nearest the register. The floor tiles felt colder out there, away from the little pocket of warmth behind the counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above my head. Blink. I stopped walking. The flicker came from somewhere overhead, but it felt directional, as if it had happened slightly deeper inside the store, like something moving toward me. I stood very still, my ears strained for anything. Fabric shifting, breathing, the scrape of a shoe. Nothing. The refrigerators hummed. A distant compressor clicked. Blink. Another pause. Another flicker. This time I realized something that made the back of my neck tighten. The pattern was consistent. Exactly consistent. Step, step. The lights weren't flickering randomly. They were pulsing in a rhythm. A walking rhythm. And that rhythm was coming down the aisle toward the front counter. My mouth went dry. "That's not funny," I said quietly, though I hadn't heard anyone come in. No response. Blink. I turned slowly and looked down the aisle behind me. Empty shelves. Plastic packaging. The faint shimmer of fluorescent light on polished tile. No one there. The lights flickered again. Blink. My shoulders stiffened. The pause afterward was shorter now. Short enough that I could imagine the space between two steps when someone begins to walk faster. Blink. Another step. Closer. The air felt different suddenly. Not colder exactly, but thicker. Like the store had filled with humidity that hadn't been there before. The buzzing lights overhead vibrated faintly. I took a step back toward the counter. Blink. Pause. Blink. 2 steps. I swallowed. My eyes moved slowly across the store again, searching for anything that might explain it. A loose fixture, a failing ballast, something electrical triggering the lights in sequence. But the pattern kept repeating. Step, step, step. Always toward the front. Always toward me. My breathing had become shallow without me noticing. Another flicker. Blink. Now it felt like it had reached the end of the aisle. The distance between flickers had shortened again. Whoever or whatever was walking had slowed, like someone approaching another person. I realized my hands were gripping the edge of the counter behind me. Blink. A single flicker. Directly above me. I looked up instinctively. The fluorescent tube buzzed and glowed, pale and humming. Then it flickered again. Blink. Right beside the register. That was the moment the realization settled fully into my mind. The lights weren't random. They weren't electrical. They were following something. Each flicker marked another step. And those steps had just reached the counter. My throat felt tight. I forced myself to look around again. The aisles behind me were empty. The refrigerators glowed softly. The glass doors reflected the pale rows of lights and the small shape of me standing alone at the front. Blink. The light above the counter flickered once more. Not in front of me. Behind me. The pause that followed felt different. Longer. Like someone standing still. Close enough to watch. I didn't turn around. The refrigerators hummed softly in the silence. The lights above the aisles glowed steady again now, no longer flickering, no longer walking. Everything was still. But I could feel something there, just behind my right shoulder. Close enough that, if I moved even slightly, I might brush against it. And for the first time since the lights started flickering, I realized the worst part. If the lights had been marking footsteps, then whatever had walked across the store had stopped. Right beside me. A customer asked if the aisle that moves was behaving tonight. He said it the same way someone might ask if the coffee machine was working. Casual. Routine. I was halfway through scanning a pack of gum when I paused. The what? I asked. The customer, an older man in a faded windbreaker, watched the register screen as if my confusion didn't matter. The scanner beeped. The receipt printer began its thin mechanical chatter. The aisle that moves, he repeated. I stared at him. We don't have. He gave a small shrug. Maybe it's quiet tonight. He took the receipt and folded it carefully before slipping it into his pocket. When he looked back up at me, his expression had that polite, distant look regulars get when they've been coming to a place longer than you've worked there. You'd know if it was acting up, he said. Then he left. The automatic doors slid open with a sigh. Cold air drifted in from the empty parking lot before the doors sealed again. I stood there for a moment listening to the refrigerators humming along the back wall. The store was almost empty. 2 long rows of aisles ran down the middle, snacks and canned food on one side, cleaning supplies and paper goods on the other. At the far end, the fluorescent lights buzzed above the freezer cases. Everything exactly where it had been when my shift started. I shook my head and threw the receipt stub away. Some customers just liked weird jokes. Still, as I stepped out from behind the counter to restock the candy rack, I noticed something that made me pause. The third aisle looked longer than I remembered. Not dramatically, just slightly, like the shelving stretched a little farther toward the back wall. I frowned. Maybe I'd never paid attention before. Night shifts blur things together. I stocked the candy slowly, my eyes drifting back to the aisles. The fluorescent lights flickered once overhead. A faint buzzing ripple moved across the ceiling fixtures. The refrigerators hummed louder for a second, then settled again. When I looked up, the aisles seemed normal. The third aisle ended exactly where it should. I let out a quiet breath and laughed under my nose. Great, I muttered. Now I'm thinking about it. I went back behind the counter. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. The store stayed silent except for the steady mechanical noises. Compressors cycling, lights buzzing, the occasional creak of cooling metal from the freezer doors. Then I noticed the floor. One tile near the drink coolers was a different shade. Not cracked, not broken, just darker, like it belonged to a different store. I crouched beside it. The tile felt smooth and cold under my fingers, perfectly level with the rest. But the grout lines didn't quite match. They angled slightly, like the tile had been rotated before it was set in place. I stood up slowly. The tile pointed toward the third aisle. My eyes drifted along that direction without thinking, and my stomach tightened. The third aisle was gone. I blinked. Where it should have been was a narrow space between the second and fourth rows, barely wide enough to walk through. I stared for a long time. The shelves on either side were exactly the same as before. Same brands, same rows of products. But the aisle itself was different. The floor tiles inside it were all that darker shade. A faint smell drifted out of the gap. Not rot, not exactly mildew, more like old cardboard and dust trapped somewhere that never gets aired out. I stepped out from behind the counter. The store suddenly felt very quiet. Each step echoed softly against the tile. When I reached the entrance to the aisle, the smell grew stronger. The lighting inside looked dimmer. Not darker, just farther away, like the bulbs were hanging higher than the rest of the store. I leaned slightly into the aisle and looked down it. The shelves were stocked, but not with anything from our inventory. Plain boxes, glass jars with faded labels, products that looked decades old. I swallowed. The aisle stretched farther than it should have. The back wall of the store was nowhere in sight. The refrigerators hummed behind me. Their reflection shimmered faintly in the freezer glass. For a moment I thought I saw movement there, like someone walking down the aisle behind me. I turned quickly. Nothing, just the empty rows. When I looked back, the aisle had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that the entrance had moved a few inches to the left. I froze. My brain tried to explain it away. Loose shelving, bad lighting, perspective tricks. But deep down something colder was settling into place. The old man's voice drifted back into my memory. Maybe it's quiet tonight. I took one cautious step into the aisle. The sound of my shoe hitting the darker tile was different. Hollow, like there was space underneath the floor. The lights above flickered softly. Behind me, the rest of the store seemed farther away than it had been a moment ago. I turned to check the counter. The register looked smaller now, as if I'd walked much farther than a single step. My pulse picked up. I stepped back toward the entrance. The moment my foot crossed the line between the tiles, the smell faded. The lights brightened. The back wall of the store snapped back into place at the end of the aisle. The shelves now held normal products again. Energy drinks, laundry detergent, paper towels. I stood there breathing slowly. The aisle looked completely normal. I walked along it once from front to back. Everything exactly where it should be. No strange boxes, no endless space, just a regular aisle. When I returned to the front of the store, the darker floor tile near the drink coolers was gone. Every tile matched perfectly again. I didn't sleep much the next day. When my shift started the following night, I checked the aisles immediately. All four were normal. But halfway through the shift, something changed. I noticed the spacing again. A gap where there hadn't been one. The third aisle had slid slightly toward the freezers, just enough to leave a narrow corridor between the shelves. And inside that corridor, the darker tiles had returned. Waiting. The smell drifted out again. Old cardboard. Dust. I didn't step inside this time. I just watched it. The longer I stood there, the more the aisle seemed to settle into place. Like something adjusting itself. Responding. After a few minutes, the gap slowly closed. The shelves aligned again. The darker tiles disappeared. everything normal. But one detail stayed wrong. At the end of the aisle, one shelf now held a single object that hadn't been there before. Plain glass jar. Inside it sat a small folded receipt. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to, because even from the front of the aisle, I could see the printed date on the paper. Tomorrow's date. And beneath it, in faint ink, was a time. 2:17 a.m. My shift tomorrow night. I stood there staring at it until the lights flickered softly above the aisles. Just once. And the shelves shifted again. Not randomly, not slowly, but deliberately, as if something inside the store had just noticed me watching.